The cave spring that rises beneath the limestone hills of Moore County, Tennessee, runs cold and iron-free through soil that has not fundamentally changed since the conclusion of the Civil War. It was into this geographically precise environment, in a county that would eventually hold fewer than 6,000 residents, that the enterprise now recognized as Jack Daniel's Tennessee Whiskey took its first operational form. The founder, Jasper Newton Daniel, was born somewhere in the middle years of the 19th century. Historical records place the event variously in 1846, 1849, and 1850, and no surviving document has settled the question with finality. He was among the younger children of Callaway and Lucinda Daniel, and he came of age during a period of profound national disruption, when the economic and social structures of rural Tennessee were being dismantled by war and slowly reassembled in its aftermath. His father's early death placed young Jasper in the care of Reverend Dan Call, a local Lutheran minister who also operated a small distillery on his farm outside Lynchburg. It was inside that modest operation that Daniel would receive the foundational education that would eventually produce one of the most recognized commercial products in American history. The convergence of geography, biography, and historical accident that produced Jack Daniel's whiskey was neither inevitable nor the result of any single man's genius. It was the product of a specific place, a craft tradition embedded in the agricultural communities of East Tennessee, and a set of social arrangements whose full dimensions only later came under sustained examination.
The figure who most directly shaped Jack Daniel's technical distillation was not Daniel himself, but a man named Nathan Green, known throughout Moore County as Uncle Nearest. Green was a formerly enslaved man who had worked at Dan Call's distillery before emancipation and continued there afterward, and by multiple historical accounts, he possessed skills in the craft of whiskey distillation that were uncommon even among experienced practitioners of the era. Green is now widely credited by historians and by the Jack Daniel's brand itself with having taught young Daniel the fundamental mechanics of what would become the Lincoln County process, the charcoal filtration technique that defines Tennessee whiskey as a legal and commercial category distinct from bourbon. For most of the 20th century, Green's name was entirely absent from the official account of how Jack Daniel's was made, a circumstance that reflected the broader and well-documented practice of omitting black contributions from American industrial and commercial narratives. It was not until a 2016 investigation by the New York Times, conducted by journalist Clay Risen, that Nathan Green's central role in the founding of Jack Daniel's was examined for a wide public audience, setting off a significant and ongoing revision of the brand's origin story.
The Jack Daniel's Company subsequently acknowledged Green's role and named him formally as the distillery's first master distiller, a recognition that arrived more than a century after his death, and that has continued to prompt discussion about the conditions under which historical contributions to American industry are preserved, obscured, or recovered.
Reverend Dan Call sold his distillery operation to Daniel in the early 1860s. The precise date is debated in the historical record, and Daniel assumed operational control of what he would eventually transform into a formal registered commercial enterprise. At the time, whiskey distillation in rural Tennessee was not an uncommon undertaking. The region had a long tradition of small-scale production that stretched back to the earliest European settlement of the Appalachian foothills, and the technical knowledge involved was embedded in agricultural communities rather than concentrated in formal institutions or licensed facilities. Daniel's contribution was not the invention of any new technique, but the systematic application and refinement of existing practices within a structure capable of being registered, taxed, and gradually expanded. He was, by most contemporary accounts, a physically small man, reportedly standing no taller than 5 feet 2 inches, with a marked preference for elaborate dress and a facility for social engagement that extended well beyond the immediate community of Moore County. These personal characteristics would eventually inform a commercial identity that balanced craftsmanship with personality, a combination that later marketing under Brown-Forman's ownership would draw upon extensively. What distinguished Daniel from other small-batch distillers of his era was less any single technical innovation than his recognition, however intuitive rather than deliberate, that the product he was making required a stable identity, a consistent process, a reliable source of raw materials, and a geographical anchor that could serve as both a practical and symbolic foundation for whatever scale the enterprise might eventually reach. The Jack Daniel Distillery was formally registered with the federal government in 1866, making it, by that agency's own records, the oldest registered distillery in the United States, a designation that the brand has maintained as a central element of its historical identity in all subsequent commercial communications. The registration took place under the federal revenue laws enacted in the years following the Civil War, which required distilleries to obtain federal licenses and pay excise taxes on production, and which created for the first time a national system for tracking and taxing commercial whiskey manufacturing at the individual facility level. Daniel selected a site in a wooded hollow on the edge of Lynchburg known for its cave spring, a natural water source that filtered through the surrounding limestone formation and emerged consistently cold and essentially free of the iron compounds that can adversely affect the flavor and character of distilled spirits. The quality of that water, its consistent temperature, and its mineral composition have been cited by the brand's master distillers across multiple generations as one of the non-replicable environmental conditions that gives Jack Daniel's its characteristic sensory profile. The hollow itself, which Daniel purchased in 1884 and which came to be known as Stillhouse Hollow, remains the operating location of the distillery to this day, a continuity of site that is unusual in American manufacturing history at any comparable scale of production. The distillery operated from the outset as a small but formally structured enterprise, employing a modest workforce and producing whiskey that moved primarily within Tennessee and into regional markets in the surrounding states, building a commercial foundation that would support considerably more ambitious expansion in the decades ahead. The process that defines Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey as a legal and qualitative category distinct from bourbon is known as the Lincoln County process, a name derived from the Tennessee county in which charcoal mellowing was practiced widely in the early 19th century, before that county was subdivided and the distillery's eventual location was placed within the borders of Moore County. The process requires that freshly distilled spirit, before it is placed into new charred white oak barrels for aging, be filtered through a column of charcoal made from sugar maple wood that has been burned in a controlled manner on the distillery grounds and then densely packed into large rectangular vats. The charcoal column is approximately 10 feet deep, and the spirit descends through it over a period of 3 to 5 days, during which the porous charcoal removes certain congeners and compounds that would otherwise remain in the whiskey and contribute to a harsher or more assertive sensory character. The result is not a flavoring process. The charcoal adds neither taste nor color, but a refinement process, one that strips the spirit of elements the distillers regard as impurities and that produces the smooth, accessible character that has defined the product's reputation across more than a century and a half of commercial operation. Under the Tennessee Whiskey Law, formally codified by the Tennessee State Legislature in 2013, the Lincoln County process is a mandatory step for any spirit labeled as Tennessee whiskey, a legal definition that Jack Daniel's lobbied actively to establish and that effectively distinguishes its product from bourbon by regulatory requirement, even though the underlying grain composition, distillation proof, and barrel specifications would otherwise qualify the spirit as bourbon under federal standards. The technical precision required to maintain the consistency of this process across a production scale that has reached millions of cases per year represents one of the more demanding operational challenges in the American spirits industry, and it has remained a non-negotiable element of the brand's production identity through every ownership and market transition the distillery has undergone. The label that Jack Daniel's has used on its principal product since the 1890s, black background, white lettering, square glass bottle with an embossed design, is among the most recognized packaging formats in the history of American consumer goods, and the numeral 7 appearing on the old number 7 label has been the subject of continuous public speculation for more than a century without a definitive resolution that the company has ever officially endorsed. Various unofficial explanations have circulated across the decades: that the number referred to the 7th Federal Revenue District under which the distillery was originally registered, that it represented Daniel's personal lucky number, that it marked the 7th formulation of the recipe that he found satisfactory, that it indicated the 7th ingredient used in production, or that it was connected to a personal or business relationship in Daniel's life that has not been substantively documented. None of these explanations has been officially confirmed by the company, and the persistent ambiguity appears to have become, at some point in the brand's management history, a deliberate rather than accidental element of its commercial identity. The square bottle itself was a departure from the cylindrical bottles that dominated the American spirits market of the late 19th century, and it served both a practical function, easier to stack and ship, and a visual distinctiveness that made the product immediately identifiable in a crowded retail environment. The decision to maintain this largely static visual identity across more than a century of commercial operation reflects a brand strategy premised on authenticity and temporal continuity, one that has been studied in marketing and business history as an unusually successful instance of resisting the pressures of trend-driven design revision while the surrounding consumer landscape changed substantially around it. Jack Daniel managed the distillery with direct personal involvement through the first decades of its existence, and by the 1880s and 1890s, the enterprise had grown from a small local operation into one of Tennessee's more visible commercial whiskey producers, with distribution extending into markets beyond the immediate region. Daniel cultivated a public persona that was deliberately informal and accessible. He was known for greeting visitors personally, for his distinctive attire, and for a mode of social engagement that positioned him as a craftsman rather than a businessman, a framing that aligned with the values of his rural Tennessee community and that his successors would eventually translate into a global marketing posture. The town of Lynchburg, which by the turn of the century held a population of several hundred, was economically and socially organized to a significant degree around the distillery's operations, and the relationship between the Motlow family, into which Daniel had no direct descendants but to whom he was closely connected, and the town would remain central through the entire first century of the brand's commercial life. Daniel entered his whiskey into competitive exhibitions held in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the brand's historical materials reference a gold medal awarded at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis as early evidence of the product's recognized quality in a formal evaluative context, though the precise circumstances of competition entries from this period are not always fully documented in surviving records. The operational decisions Daniel made in these years, the insistence on a single primary product, the commitment to the cave spring water, the maintenance of the charcoal mellowing step, established a set of constraints that his successors would treat as essentially inviolable, not because they were legally required, but because they had by that time become the defining attributes of the product's identity and the source of whatever reputation it had earned. Jack Daniel died on October 9, 1911, from complications related to blood poisoning, and the account of the injury that ultimately caused his death, that he kicked his office safe in frustration after forgetting the combination, injuring his left foot, which then became infected and eventually resulted in gangrene that spread through his system, has been repeated so consistently in the brand's own historical materials, in press accounts and in distillery tour narratives, that it has acquired the status of established fact, though some details of this account are difficult to verify independently at this chronological remove. What is established with confidence is that Daniel transferred operational control of the distillery to his nephew, Lem Motlow, and another family member in 1907, several years before his death, as his health declined and he became less able to manage the enterprise directly. Lem Motlow was by temperament and training as much a businessman as a distiller. He served in the Tennessee state legislature and was a significant landholder in Moore County, and his management of the distillery would be characterized by political engagement and institutional navigation as much as by production decisions. Daniel's death at an age that was itself uncertain, most estimates place him in his early to mid-60s, removed from the enterprise its founding personality and its most direct link to the craft tradition that Nathan Green had transmitted, but not the operational identity that had been sufficiently codified by that point to survive the transition.
The brand's historical materials have consistently framed Daniel's death as a moment of narrative punctuation rather than institutional rupture, a presentation supported by the distillery's continued operation under Motlow's management and by the unchanged character of the product in the years that immediately followed.
Tennessee enacted statewide prohibition in 1910, a full decade before the passage of the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution that imposed national prohibition, and the Jack Daniel Distillery was forced to close its Lynchburg operations as a direct result of this state-level legislation. The timing placed Lem Motlow in an acutely difficult position. He had assumed operational control of a functioning and commercially viable enterprise, and within 3 years found himself legally prohibited from operating it in the state where it had been registered and built. Motlow sought and obtained licenses to operate distilleries in Missouri and Alabama during the Tennessee Prohibition years, maintaining production under the Jack Daniel's name in locations outside his home state, though the scale of those operations and the degree to which the product could accurately be described as continuous with the Lynchburg enterprise in terms of process and raw materials are questions that have not been fully resolved in the surviving historical record. When national prohibition was enacted in 1919 and took effect in January 1920, it effectively terminated all of Motlow's licensed whiskey production, and the Jack Daniel's brand entered a period of complete commercial dormancy that would extend in various forms for nearly 2 decades.
The repeal of national prohibition in 1933 did not immediately resolve the situation in Tennessee, which retained its own state and county-level alcohol restrictions, and Motlow spent the subsequent years lobbying the Tennessee state legislature to permit legal distilling to resume in Moore County, a political effort that, by all available accounts, was prolonged, contentious, and complicated by the deep entrenchment of temperance sentiment in the rural communities that held political influence over the matter.
Lem Motlow's campaign to reopen the Lynchburg distillery after national prohibition was a legislative project that consumed the better part of the 1930s and required sustained engagement with a Tennessee legislature in which many members remained deeply skeptical of the distilled spirits industry, regardless of the national legal context. The Tennessee General Assembly voted to permit licensed distilling in Moore County in 1938, and the distillery reopened that year or the next, accounts differ on the specific date, after a gap of more than 2 decades during which no legally produced Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey had been made in its founding location. The equipment required to restart production had to be substantially rebuilt, and the workforce of skilled distillery workers that had existed before 1910 had dispersed irretrievably over the intervening decades, requiring Motlow to reconstitute much of the operational knowledge the distillery depended upon through a combination of retained institutional memory and the reacquisition of craft skills from practitioners in the broader Tennessee whiskey tradition. The years between the reopening and the end of World War II were characterized by constrained production. Wartime federal grain allocation policies restricted the amount of grain available for beverage alcohol production across the entire American spirits industry, and the distillery operated at reduced capacity through the mid-1940s.
Despite these constraints, Motlow worked to re-establish the brand's presence in the distribution markets where it had been known before Prohibition, and by the time of his death in 1947, the distillery had returned to something approximating its pre-Prohibition operational footing, though its national profile remained substantially smaller than it would become in the decades that followed under a different ownership structure entirely.
The post-war period brought a shift in American consumer culture that would eventually benefit Jack Daniel's substantially, though the effects were not immediate or uniform. Returning veterans and a rapidly expanding middle class with growing disposable income drove a broad expansion of the American spirits market in the late 1940s and 1950s, and Tennessee whiskey, distinguished from bourbon by its charcoal mellowing step and its specific geographical and procedural identity, began attracting the attention of distributors and retailers in markets that had not previously been served by the brand. Lem Motlow's sons, who inherited operational control of the distillery after his death, continued the family's management through this period, and production expanded incrementally as demand from regional markets increased. The distillery remained, however, a relatively modest operation by the standards of the American spirits industry during these years. Its output represented a small fraction of the production volumes achieved by the major Kentucky bourbon houses, and its reach was limited by the constraints of a family-run enterprise without the capital resources to mount a national marketing campaign or to build the distribution infrastructure that national ambitions would require. The product itself had been refined and stabilized in the years since reopening, and the consistency of the charcoal mellowing process and the cave spring water supply gave the whiskey a reliable character that made it, in the judgment of those who encountered it, capable of competing at a national level given the right combination of resources and market timing. Those resources arrived in 1956 with the acquisition of the distillery by Brown-Forman Corporation. Brown-Forman Corporation, a Louisville, Kentucky-based spirits and wine company that had been founded in 1870 and had survived national prohibition by obtaining one of 6 federal licenses to produce medicinal whiskey, acquired the Jack Daniel Distillery in 1956 for a reported price of approximately $20 million, a figure that, by multiple accounts, exceeded Brown-Forman's net worth at the time of the transaction and required the company to assume substantial debt to complete the purchase. The acquisition was proposed to and accepted by the Motlow heirs, who retained a ceremonial presence with the distillery's operations in subsequent years, but who transferred full commercial and strategic authority to Brown-Forman's management. For Brown-Forman, the acquisition constituted a significant financial bet on the growth potential of a brand that, at the time of sale, was distributing approximately 150,000 to 200,000 9-liter cases per year, a market position that was profitable but by no means dominant within the competitive American spirits landscape. The strategic judgment underlying the decision to preserve the distillery in Lynchburg, maintain the charcoal mellowing process without modification, and retained the established visual identity of the old number 6 label was that the brand's authenticity, its specific place, its specific process, its unchanged appearance, constituted its primary commercial asset, and that altering these elements to pursue broader market trends would destroy the very quality that gave the product its competitive distinctiveness. This conservation strategy, premised on the proposition that the brand's value was embedded in what it had already become, rather than in what it might be made into, would be validated in subsequent decades by dramatic growth in Jack Daniel's global sales volume. And the 1956 acquisition has since been examined in business history as one of the more consequential corporate transactions in the American food and beverage industry.
Under Brown-Forman's ownership, the 1960s and 1970s brought a period of systematic national and international distribution expansion for Jack Daniel's, enabled by marketing investments that the Motlow family had not been positioned to make as an independent concern. Brown-Forman deployed its existing distribution infrastructure and the financial resources of a publicly traded company to secure retail and on-premise placement in markets across the continental United States, and the brand's annual sales volume grew substantially through this period, rising from the modest case counts of the acquisition years to several million cases by the close of the 1970s. The marketing strategy that Brown-Forman and its agencies developed for Jack Daniel's during this period was built around the distillery's location in Lynchburg, a small, rural Tennessee community, as a conscious counterpoint to the scale and anonymity of the broader American consumer market. Advertisements in national magazines and newspapers emphasized the handcrafted character of the product, the unchanged water source, the charcoal mellowing step, and the unbroken continuity of the distillery's operations since its 1866 registration.
This positioning, which amounted to a sustained argument for authenticity in a marketplace increasingly dominated by industrial-scale production and trend-driven product development, was unusual for the American advertising environment of the 1960s and 1970s, when the prevailing consumer culture was generally oriented toward novelty and modernization rather than preservation and historical continuity.
The resonance of this approach with consumers proved durable well beyond the campaigns of any single decade, and the Lynchburg identity, the small town, the wooded hollow, the cave spring, became not merely a marketing element, but a genuine anchor of consumer perception that distinguished Jack Daniel's from bourbon competitors and from other American spirits brands in ways that competitors found difficult to replicate. The association between Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey and Frank Sinatra represents one of the more consequential unpaid celebrity endorsements in American marketing history, and it arose through the performer's documented personal preference rather than through any commercial arrangement or paid partnership. Sinatra, who was at the peak of his commercial and cultural influence in the late 1950s and through the 1960s, reportedly discovered Jack Daniel's during the period of his professional association with the informal entertainment group that became publicly known as the Rat Pack, and he made his preference for the whiskey a matter of public record in performances, interviews, and social settings across multiple years. The remark most frequently attributed to him, that Jack Daniel's was the nectar of the gods, circulated in American entertainment coverage and aligned the brand with a particular image of masculine sophistication and American ease that was central to Sinatra's public persona and that carried significant cultural weight in the mid-century consumer environment. Brown-Forman sales representatives reportedly made a consistent practice of ensuring that Jack Daniel's was available in whatever city Sinatra was performing, and the brand's awareness in entertainment industry circles and among the broader national consuming public grew measurably as a result of this sustained informal association. Sinatra was buried with a bottle of Jack Daniel's, a detail that has been widely reported across multiple sources and that has become part of the brand's cultural narrative, though the degree to which this final gesture reflected a purely personal preference versus a deliberate image decision is a question that cannot be definitively resolved. What the sales data of the period reflects is that the brand's volume in national markets grew sharply through the years of Sinatra's most visible association, and that the New York and Los Angeles markets, previously outside the brand's primary distribution geography, became significant contributors to its commercial totals. If Frank Sinatra gave Jack Daniel's its entry into the world of mid-century American entertainment culture, the association of the brand with rock and roll music during the 1970s and 1980s consolidated its position as a cultural signifier that transcended both geography and demographic category. Photographs and film footage of Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, Slash of Guns N' Roses, and Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin with Jack Daniel's bottles and glasses became part of the visual iconography of rock music during this period, appearing in backstage photographs, concert films, and documentary footage with a frequency that no quantity of conventional advertising expenditure could have produced or planned. The brand did not, in most documented instances, formally sponsor or arrange these appearances. They arose from the genuine preferences of musicians who found in Jack Daniel's a product that aligned with a particular aesthetic of American roughness and working-class authenticity that rock music culture valued and projected during these decades. The image that the brand projected, a small-town Tennessee distillery making an unchanged product with an unchanged label, operating outside the mainstream of industrial consumer culture, was not incidental to its appeal in rock music circles, but structurally central to it. By the mid-1980s, Jack Daniel's had achieved a level of cultural saturation in popular music that made it, for a substantial portion of the American and international consuming public, not merely a beverage preference, but an affiliation with a specific set of values and associations that the brand's visual and narrative identity had come to represent through accumulation rather than design. The commercial effect of this cultural embedding was reflected in continued sales growth through the decade, and in the brand's increasing international recognition in markets that had had little prior exposure to American whiskey. The product diversification strategy that Brown-Forman implemented for the Jack Daniel's brand beginning in the late 1980s represented a calibrated departure from the single product identity that had characterized the brand through the first century of its commercial existence and that had been central to its marketing posture throughout the post-acquisition growth period.
Gentleman Jack, introduced in 1988, was the first significant extension of the product line and was designed to address a growing consumer segment seeking premium-positioned American whiskeys with a distinctly smoother sensory profile. Gentleman Jack undergoes the charcoal mellowing process twice rather than once, producing a spirit that is measurably lighter and less assertive than the standard Old No. 7. The single barrel program, launched in 1997, addressed a different segment, the collector and connoisseur audience that had driven sustained growth in premium bourbon expressions and that was seeking comparable offerings within the Tennessee whiskey category. Individual barrels from the rickhouses are selected by master distillers based on their individual flavor development across the aging period, and each bottle from the single barrel program carries a specific barrel identification that allows the consumer to trace the product to a particular container in a particular warehouse at a particular time.
Tennessee Honey, introduced in 2011, extended the brand into the flavored spirits category that was expanding rapidly across the American market, blending Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey with a honey liqueur and targeting consumers, including women and legal drinking age adults newer to the whiskey category, who had not previously been drawn to straight American whiskey. Subsequent line extensions, including Tennessee Fire and Tennessee Apple, followed a similar structural logic, using the parent brand's established identity and distribution infrastructure as a platform for products with broader accessibility and different flavor profiles than the core expression.
Among the more persistent paradoxes associated with Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey is the fact that the distillery operates within Moore County, a jurisdiction that remained legally dry, prohibiting the retail sale of alcohol by the bottle and by the drink for the greater part of the 20th century, and that has retained significant alcohol sale restrictions to the present day. Visitors to the Jack Daniel Distillery in Lynchburg could tour the facility and observe every stage of the production process, from the charcoal mellowing vats to the rickhouse aging warehouses, but they could not legally purchase a bottle of the whiskey on the premises or order a drink at any restaurant in the surrounding town. This circumstance, which has been noted in travel writing, cultural commentary, and press coverage of the brand for decades, reflects the layered history of temperance legislation in rural Tennessee, where Baptist and Methodist religious traditions sustained political opposition to commercial alcohol sales long after national prohibition and most state-level restrictions had ended elsewhere in the country. The situation was partially addressed in 1995 when Moore County voters approved a measure creating a limited exception to the dry county status, allowing the distillery to sell bottled Jack Daniel's products from its gift shop, with those bottles formally classified as collectible items rather than as retail alcohol transactions. This legislative arrangement remains in effect, and visitors completing the distillery tour may purchase bottles on the premises, while the broader county retail and restaurant environment remains subject to alcohol sales. The coexistence of the world's largest-selling American whiskey brand with a dry county political and legal framework has been examined in multiple business, legal, and political analyses as an illustration of the durability of local regulatory structures, even in the presence of globally significant commercial activity.
The question of Nathan Green's formal standing in the history of Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey remained largely unaddressed in the brand's public communications through most of the 20th century, and it was not until the second decade of the 21st century that a combination of investigative journalism and changing cultural standards around the acknowledgement of Black contributions to American commercial and industrial history brought the matter to sustained national attention. The 2016 New York Times article by Clay Risen drew on historical records, including census documents, local land records, and period accounts, to establish with substantial documentary support that Green had been the primary instructor in whiskey distillation for the young Jack Daniel, and that he had subsequently served in a supervisory capacity at the distillery in its early years of registered operation. The response from Brown-Forman and from Jack Daniel's representatives in the years following the article's publication was to formally incorporate Green into the brand's historical communications, naming him the distillery's first master distiller, adding substantive acknowledgement of his role to the facility's tour narrative, and participating in broader public discussions about the historical conditions that had resulted in his erasure from the official account.
A separate whiskey brand named Uncle Nearest, launched in 2017 by entrepreneur Fawn Weaver, specifically to honor Green's memory and to produce whiskey within the tradition he had represented, achieved significant commercial attention and critical recognition in its early years. Subsequent reporting in 2024 and 2025 indicated that the company encountered substantial financial difficulties, with accounts of significant debt obligations and operational pressures, though the brand's trajectory beyond those reports had not been fully resolved as of the time this material was prepared. The broader cultural and institutional conversation initiated by Green's belated recognition has continued, in academic, journalistic, and corporate contexts, to examine the structural conditions under which contributions to American commercial history are preserved, suppressed, or selectively recovered. The decade of the 2020s presented Jack Daniel's and its parent company Brown-Forman with a set of operational and market challenges that marked a significant departure from the sustained growth trajectory that had characterized most of the brand's post-acquisition history. Global whiskey consumption, which had expanded substantially in the 2010s on the combined strength of the American craft spirits movement and growing international demand for American-origin products, began to plateau or contract in certain markets as consumer preferences shifted measurably toward ready-to-drink cocktails, tequila-based expressions, and in some demographic segments, non-alcoholic alternatives. Brown-Forman's financial disclosures for the fiscal years ending in 2024 and 2025 reflected declining volumes across the Jack Daniel's family of products in multiple markets, with the company attributing part of the shortfall to the effects of international trade disputes and retaliatory tariff measures that affected the brand's export economics, most acutely in the Canadian market, where tariffs on American spirits were implemented in the context of broader bilateral trade tensions. During this same period, the brand engaged in a legal action that reached the highest court in the American judicial system. In June 2023, the United States Supreme Court issued a unanimous decision in Jack Daniel's Properties, Inc., the
VIP Products, LLC, a case originating in a dog toy manufacturer's production of a parody item shaped and labeled to resemble the old No. 7 bottle. The court held that the First Amendment's protections for expressive content do not automatically shield a commercial product from trademark infringement analysis when that product is being used as a designation of source in commerce, a ruling with implications for American trademark law that extended considerably beyond the specific commercial dispute between the parties. The distillery's operational infrastructure continued to expand through this period, with approximately 97 rickhouses and more than 2 million barrels aging across a 3,000-acre complex in Lynchburg, reflecting long-term production commitments that the brand's management was sustaining, even as near-term sales volumes in certain markets moved downward.
Jack Daniel's Tennessee Whiskey arrives at the present moment as a brand shaped by decisions, relationships, and historical circumstances that its founders and early operators could not have anticipated, and that its current owners navigate within a commercial and cultural environment that continues to evolve in ways that resist confident prediction. The distillery in Lynchburg, still drawing water from the same cave spring that Jack Daniel identified in the 1860s, still filtering its spirit through sugar maple charcoal, still aging its whiskey in white oak barrels stacked in the wooden rickhouses that rise across the hills of Moore County, represents a degree of operational continuity that is uncommon in American manufacturing history at this scale of production. More than 14 million 9-liter cases of Jack Daniel's products were sold globally in 2023 across distribution in more than 170 countries. And the square black and white label remains among the most immediately recognized commercial symbols in the global beverage industry, regardless of the consumer's familiarity with the product itself.
The questions that remain open, the precise origin of the numeral on the label, the full dimensions of Nathan Green's contribution to the technical tradition the distillery practices, the long-term trajectory of American whiskey consumption in a market where consumer preferences are diversifying more rapidly than at any prior point in the brand's history, are questions that the brand's managers, historians, and consumers will not resolve on any shared timeline. What the historical record permits with reasonable confidence is the observation that the enterprise developed in the limestone hollow outside Lynchburg in the years following the Civil War eventually produced one of the more durable artifacts of American commercial culture. Not because it was the first of its kind, nor the most technically refined, nor the most widely distributed at its inception, but because a specific and unusual combination of product consistency, geographical identity, historical circumstance, and cultural association gave it a meaning that extended well beyond the contents of the bottle, and that proved, across 160 years of commercial operation, resistant to the forces that have ended other enterprises of comparable age and origin.